So today I'll be talking about meadow restorations, and most of the work that I'm going to be talking about was done by my former graduate student, Carrie Plevniak, who's now at the University of Pittsburgh. Um, Interesting. There we go. Okay. So first of all, this is a picture of a lot of people managing Japanese knotweed. So in the East, we have many invasives. One of the differences between the East and the West is that you also have big invasive plant problems, but you have fewer of them, fewer different species. And in the East, we have lots and lots of species, but this is definitely one of the most troublesome in our area, Japanese knotweed. And a lot of volunteers help out with invasive management. When I give talks to the public about invasive species, I often have people coming up afterwards and asking me, about this and discussing. They're very excited. I did a big project. We removed a lot of Japanese knotweed. And then I always ask them, have you been back since then? And what does it look like? And unfortunately, with a lot of invasive management, the invasives come back, especially if they are close to dispersal corridors, like along rivers or close to roads. So we spend a lot of effort trying to remove invasives and restore habitat. And that's not always stable, what we create temporarily. And so one of the frustrating things in working with invasions is that there's not always a lot that we can change. So pictured on this graph here is the results of a model that I did during my postdoc time, focused on Japanese stiltgrass, which is a forest invasive species. Let me grab the laser pointer, pictured here. And in the model, we were looking at how big the infestation gets, which is the y-axis. And then we had either not managing at all, and then we were contrasting a whole bunch of different management scenarios, most of which were focused on changing road management practices. And unfortunately, none of them really did a great job in reducing the invasion. And just because Robert is hosting me, I decided to put in at least one picture of goldenrod so that we could talk about goldenrod. One of the things that we worked on together that I need to revisit is a model that we were working on looking at the population growth of goldenrods. Our native goldenrods are, of course, invasive in Europe. And we were contrasting their population growth rates as a function of increasing management intensity along the x-axis. So how big is the population growing? And if you wanted the population to shrink instead of grow, you would actually have to remove almost all of it. So various reductions in stem density associated with possible management practices were probably not enough to actually turn things around. And management itself can be fairly destructive, and sometimes that destruction pays off and sometimes it doesn't. The other problem with management is that it can be very expensive to do. Even if you have a lot of volunteers, there are typically significant costs associated with removing invasives and trying to establish a different type of community. So one of the things that's very important is to focus on assessing what we actually get out of management projects. And in our work, we work with managers of area parks near us. We also have a national park in Northeast Ohio. And there are frequent management projects in our area, but not always as much formal assessment of what happened after restoration. And one of the types of projects that we commonly have are meadow restorations. And that's a slightly odd thing for the northeastern part of the country, which, because of the abundant rainfall, everything here would be a forest, more or less. But we have a large history of agriculture. And because of shifts in where prairies actually are, we have a significant amount of endangered birds that now come through some of the open areas in Ohio. And so sometimes we don't want to let a forest come back. We actually want to establish a non-woody community. And around here, we call those meadows. Most of them are slightly wet meadows. And that's a common restoration goal in our area. The other situation that we commonly have is that managers may be working with a degraded site. Some of our sites used to be garbage dumps, and so you can't really let trees or very deeply rooted species grow there. because that would kind of break through potentially the cap over the former landfill site. So that's another issue that we have. So having meadows and open areas here in Northeast Ohio and the Northeastern US is actually a management goal that comes up fairly often. So when I talk to managers who have performed these types of restorations, they mention several goals commonly. One of them is obviously to remove non-native species, especially invasive species, to increase the conservation value and create better habitat for pollinators and wildlife. Many people use the term enhance ecosystem services for sort of a general wish to create ecosystems that are more intact and are providing the types of ecosystem services that maybe used to be provided before this habitat was disturbed or degraded. And so when we're talking about meadows, there's a number of important ecosystem services that we might be concerned with. One of the most frequently mentioned is actually pollinator services and habitat for wildlife, especially birds. So that's a big focus for our area land managers. In addition, meadows provide opportunity for soil stabilization and nutrient retention, as well as carbon storage and water regulation. So in the research that I'm going to talk about today, we focused on trying to assess what we actually gain from restorations, both by looking at before and after, as well as comparing similar restored and unrestored areas. Seldom do we actually get to do both of those, but we were lucky enough to be able to survey before a new restoration went in, and then we also took a regional look at areas that were restored, some of them 20 years ago, and compared similar adjacent areas that were unrestored. And so these pictures here are just meant to help illustrate that. So this is a before restoration, and this is actually in the same field after restoration. So you can see that there's quite a big difference there from restoration. And then some of what we did is looked at areas like this big open field here, where part of it was restored and another part of it is actually unrestored. And so it's close enough, it's in the same field, has generally received similar-ish management after restoration, and so we can compare those two. Okay, so when we assess restorations more formally,
I just wanted to mute us.
the things that is more commonly focused on is also the number of native species. Okay. And sometimes we're focused on looking at the diversity. For example, the Shannon diversity, there's a lot of different diversity metrics that we use. And also the percent cover of native is a common focus, as well as what's called the coefficient of conservatism, which I'll explain in a minute. Okay. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Still?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So in terms of functional assessments, I'll explain a little bit more about functional traits in a minute, but you can see in this picture here that we have 4 different plant species, and they have somewhat different functional traits that we can observe here. So an important functional trait is the root structure, and here we have a much longer, deeper root structure than this plant on the right. And actually plant height is another important functional trait. And that can vary tremendously. Here we have a shorter plant, and then the other 3 plants are actually more similar in their height. So we may, from a functional perspective, we may be interested in the mean value. What's the mean value of some of these traits before restoration? But typically we're also interested in having a greater amount of functional diversity. So we don't want to have a field where everything is the same height and all the rooting depths are the same height, in part because diversity of functional traits is associated with the provisioning of better ecosystem services. So one of the things that we looked at is called the coefficient of conservatism, which measures the conservation value of species. So this is a ranking system that's done for various plants, typically by state and done by expert botanists of that state. Things like invasive and non-native species. So over here we have a non-native clover species, and that has a coefficient of conservatism of 0. Whereas on the right we have the stiff goldenrod, which is native, and it is somewhat rare or within a narrow habitat, found within a narrow range of habitats, and so it has a conservation coefficient of conservatism of 8. So the more native plants, the more rare they are, the more indicators they are of higher quality habitats, then the higher value of coefficient of conservatism they would have. In terms of plant functional traits, I mentioned a few of them a little bit ago, but I'll emphasize in this study, we tried to look at the broad categories that are really important for plants. So in terms of leaf functional trait, we looked at the leaf dry matter content. We also looked at the height of plants, the seed mass of plants, the rooting depth of plants, and we looked at phenology. More specifically, we looked at the floral phenology, in part because there was such an emphasis on providing pollinator resources. So generally speaking, when we change a community, say from looking like this to maybe looking like that, in any community, according to the mass ratio hypothesis, whatever is the most abundant will influence the community the most. And so most of the time when we're thinking about these functional traits, we look at shifts in the community weighted means of species. So if we had a shift from generally shorter species to taller species, we would say that the community weighted mean has changed for that functional trait. And the other aspect of it, though, that we're interested when we're looking at many species being there has to do with the diversity of these traits. So there's two ways that we measured functional diversity, and one is called functional evenness, which has to do with how regularly distributed those traits are. So if we were talking about heights, a fairly even functional community would have almost every single possible height. So pictured here, for example, this is an example with leaf nitrogen content. High functional evenness would basically mean that there was equal representation along almost the entire range. Whereas this community down here has gaps in that distribution. So it has sort of a peak here, a peak here, a peak here, and a peak there. We would say that it has lower functional evenness. And we can also think about multifunctional traits. So when we're thinking about both height and seed mass and the phenology all at the same time, we can look at functional evenness from a multi-trait perspective. And then, so this graph is basically trying to visualize that for two traits. If we imagine plotting all of them in trait space and looking at the connections, the centroid, or kind of the middle of that distribution, would be maybe around here. And we're looking at how evenly are we finding species along all of the arms of this distribution. So if it's more evenly distributed, then we have approximately equal distributions of all the traits. And if it's less evenly distributed, then we probably have more gaps in there. The other way that we looked at functional diversity is called functional dispersion, which has more to do with the distance from the mean. So pictured here, this is for two traits, and we have each of the dots would represent a species and what the traits were of that species. The middle here is basically the weighted mean of this distribution. And functional dispersion looks at the average distance from the middle. So do we have everything is very centered around particular size and seed mass and whatever, or do we have lots of species represented that are kind of further away from that mean and we have more dispersion? It's more dispersed in trait space. Functional dispersion as well as functional evenness are characteristics that we can look at both for one trait at a time, and we can look at aggregates that are looking at multiple traits at the same time. But the reason that we care about this, generally speaking, is that higher taxonomic and functional diversity are linked to better ecosystem services, especially functional diversity. So because managers are asking for better ecosystem services, one way that we can look at that is by trying to assess how much functional diversity restoration has added to a system. Okay, so that's enough introductory information, and let me talk to you a little bit about how we collected the data that we collected and then jump into some results. So the first experiment that I'm going to talk about is where we actually had a chance to survey before restoration and then for 2 years after restoration to see what restoration had done. In this survey, we actually looked at 2 different methods of seeding. The common restoration approach in our area is that you first mow and then you use kind of a burn down herbicide and then seed with native seed mixes. And we looked at 2 different seeding methods to put the seeds in. One is just broadcast seeding, which is more or less randomly scattering or haphazardly scattering seeds on the surface. And the other method is drill seeding, where the seeds are actually placed below the surface of the soil. This was developed for agriculture, but it comes up more and more in restoration as one way to try and give the seeds a little bit of a better start. And I should mention that all of the fields that we looked at were previously agricultural. So they were agricultural, and in our area, it's less profitable to do agriculture. So we have a lot of former agricultural fields that get donated to park systems, and then the land managers are tasked with restoring them in some way. Okay, so we were looking at whether there's a difference in diversity before and after seeding, and we were also interested in whether broadcast and drill seeding were different. So we hypothesized that species would establish in both plots, but probably in different abundances. We expected there to be a higher taxonomic diversity after restoration. And we also expected that restoration would increase the conservation value of those communities. And we expected to see higher functional diversity after seeding. So the survey method that we use is called the North Carolina Vegetation Survey. It's a modular protocol that's meant to be useful in case your field is not a particular shape. So there are 10 larger blocks that are 10 by 10 meters each. And if you can, this is laid out as 50 meters by 20 meters. All 10 of them are surveyed, but the inner 4 are surveyed in a nested design, starting up from a very tiny plot of just 0.1 meters along a side, and then scaling up from there in both corners and then surveying the plot. In both of the surveys that we used, we recorded the presence of all species as well as all plant species, as well as the percent cover of the species that were there. To understand how this related to the functional diversity of traits, we needed to pick appropriate traits. One of the important recommendations from the literature suggests that you need, first of all, to be able to identify at least 80% of the species and have trait information for about 80% of the species. So we were lucky that we were able to do that, but that limits the traits that you can use because you need to find common traits that you have for those species that make up 80% of the cover of the plots. So in terms of how we got traits, some of them were from the plant trait databases, which one of them has the charming name of the Try Plant Database because they wanted to try to make a database. I thought it would be an acronym, but it's not. This one has, the last time I looked, it had about 300,000 plant taxa and close to 12 million plant trait records. We also use the USDA Plants Database, which has some information, especially about phenology, as well as estimates from the literature directly, and we collected some of them ourselves, especially leaf dry matter content was not available from these databases for all of the plants that we needed to account for. So these are the final traits then that we settled on. And then just to relate them, because we're interested in them, to think about ecosystem services. So leaf dry matter content and height are both related to competitive ability, and they're linked to soil fertility, nutrient cycling, and productivity. Seed mass is linked to establishment success, negatively linked to how far they can go. Fecundity, seed bank longevity, and also competitive ability. In terms of ecosystem services, seed mass is important as a food resource for all the different bird species and insect species that are found in these fields. Phenology is very heavily related to pollination, and then the ecosystem service associated would be pollination services, but it's also associated with other ecosystem services as well, such as soil fertility and nutrient cycling. And then rooting depth plays critical roles in basically moving water transporting water and is related to water regulation, soil stability, and also carbon sequestration. Okay, so here are finally some of our results. So first of all, this is looking at the 2 years post-restoration. The restoration happened in 2016. And so this is the first year after restoration, and this is the second year after restoration. And these first graphs are just focused on the species that were planted. So the species that managers were trying to establish. There were approximately 35 species that they were trying to establish. And if you'll take a look at the y-axis of species richness, a little disappointingly, not a lot of them established in the first year, looking a little better in the second year, but they did not see all species establish in all of these plots for sure. And the broadcast seeding, which is this darker gray, definitely had both a higher species richness, a significantly higher species richness both years post-restoration. It also did have more percent cover, so a higher abundance established, but those differences are not actually significantly different. These two seeding techniques also appeared to have slightly different benefits. So in terms of increasing the overall native diversity, not just of the species that were planted, but also the species that were already in the field, drill seeding led to a higher native diversity, but the broadcast seeding actually led to a higher coefficient of conservatism, which was interesting. So depending on what you want, these techniques may lead to different types of benefits. Restoration definitely shifted the plant community. So this is an NMS, or a multivariate ordination of the plant community itself. And the unfilled circles and triangles are before restoration. And then, I'm sorry, I'm saying this wrong. No, I'm saying it right, okay. This is before restoration, and then these down here are after restoration. So there was a big shift in the communities as a function of restoration. They also look different, as I showed you before, in the broadcast and drill communities. And this is also a multivariate ordination of that. They are significantly different. The drill are the black dots over here, and then the red are the broadcast. And then we looked into an indicator species analysis to try and figure out which species are more associated with that. The drill seeded plot, for example, is associated with the presence of more dandelions, which is not what we were actually going for. And the broadcast is associated with, for example, some of the slightly rarer natives that we're trying to establish in this. And just to show you again, visually, they do actually look rather different. In terms of the traits that we saw a variation in how restoration shifted the community weighted mean. So these plots here, the two lefts on the left are always pre-restoration, and then the two on the right are post-restoration. So we do see some changes in, this is the leaf dry matter content changed and became slightly smaller, which is associated with being less competitive, which is not exactly what we were going for, but the heights actually increased to some extent. So a slight increase in the heights. Seed mass, not too much of a change, a slight decrease for the drill plots. And then the rooting depths did actually increase, which was one of the expectations that we had for this restoration. For both broadcast and drill seeding, the root depth increased. Restoration actually didn't greatly shift the phenology. This is looking at the floral provisioning and the relative when things are flowering. And so it looks like we have some middle to late spring flowering species, a fairly sizable gap in the summer. Most of the species that were there are actually wind pollinated, and that didn't change very much between 2016 is the darker gray and 2018 is the lighter gray. And that was consistent across both of the seeding methods that we talked about. We didn't really see a difference in the functional diversity as a result of seeding. So we were expecting increases in both functional evenness and functional dispersion, and we really didn't see that. So that was interesting to see that with all the efforts of restoration, we did have some successes, but we didn't really see a shift in the diversity of functional traits that are present after restoration. I do want to add a caveat, though, to this, which is that we only looked at the first 2 years after restoration. And in the second study that I'm going to show you, it's clear that things probably get slowly better over time. So we do have plans to resurvey this field in maybe another 5 years. And so we can see perhaps some of these differences take a little longer to establish. So going back to our first set of hypotheses, we did see lots of species established, but not all of species, and they were different in the different types of restoration. We did see higher taxonomic diversity in terms of native species. We didn't see higher functional diversity, but we did see higher conservation value. So the conservation value did increase. And this is still early days in this study, though, as I mentioned. So we'll see. This is kind of a to be continued study. All right, let me take a sip of water. So the second study that I want to tell you about is a more regional perspective. We worked with 5 park systems to look at restorations. So this is a map of Ohio, and we are here in Northeast Ohio in the Cleveland area. And we worked with 5 park systems, and we had 5 pairs of restored and unrestored sites. Some of them were restored 5 years, I think was maybe one of the more recent ones, and up to 20 years ago. These were all, again, sites that were previously agricultural, and they were all at least 1.5 acres, which by Montana standards is not very impressive, but we have a much more fragmented landscape here in Northeast Ohio. They were all seeded as a method of restoration, and they were managed in similar ways. So in our area, you have to mow to keep it looking like this. So most of them are mowed every few years to make sure that shrubs and trees don't establish. We had similar hypotheses to before. We expected, but now we're comparing restored and unrestored instead of before and after. We expected restored areas would be more taxonomically and functionally diverse. We expected restored areas would have greater functional diversity, and we were expecting better floral phenology. We hadn't looked at the other study yet, of course, when we started this. We expected that restored areas would have more native plants, and that this would probably increase over time. So the longer since restoration, the higher native abundance we were expecting, and we did expect that restored areas would have higher conservation value. These sites were surveyed the same as before, and we also looked at the same traits as before because we were able to gather these traits for the species that we actually observed. Sadly, no big difference in overall species richness or diversity. The native abundances that we saw did vary between restored and unrestored sites. So the darker is actually unrestored and the lighter gray is restored. And then there's an arrow on the bottom of this graph to remind me to tell you that these are the most recently restored sites, and these were restored a long time ago. So our 2 oldest sites actually have a big difference in restored and unrestored, such that restored sites have many more natives present. And so when we look at this as a function of time since restoration, which is what's on the x-axis here, looking at the percent change in native abundance between the restored and unrestored sites, we actually do have a significant increase with time. So the longer it's been since a restoration took place, the higher the abundance of native species. And this is very good news for management. And we also did see higher conservation value in those restored meadows. So here in this graph, these are restored meadows, and then we have unrestored meadows over here. This is the community weighted coefficient of conservatism, which is higher, significantly higher in the restored meadows. We still have the same phenological issue that we had before. We don't really have consistent floral provisioning across the year. Summer is a little skimpy, and most of them actually don't even have a great spring flowering species. So we just have kind of late summer and summer, but spring to early midsummer are not as abundant, and then very little here in the fall. From a functional perspective, this was a little disappointing. We did not really see that restoration changed many of the functional trait means. So here, this is the leaf dry matter content and the height, and we saw similar results with the other traits. There wasn't a big shift in the means, and there wasn't a big shift in the functional diversity either. So this is the multivariate, multi-trait response in evenness and dispersion. And we don't really see that restored has higher functional evenness at all. There's maybe a slight tendency for functional dispersion to be a little bit higher in restored sites, but that difference was not significant. So going back to our hypotheses then, we didn't actually see that restored areas were more taxonomically and functionally diverse. And restored areas didn't have greater functional evenness, nor did they, actually that one I think maybe has the wrong check mark. Oh, okay. Native abundance did increase with time since restoration. Overall, when we include some of the younger sites, we don't have an overall increase of greater abundance of native plants, but it gets better over time. And we did see that restored sites had higher conservation value. So going back to the management goals that we had in the beginning, restoration did help increase the abundance of natives over time, and did also increase the conservation value of the sites. However, if we're going to motivate restoration with increasing ecosystem services, the functional traits are not yet bearing out that that is one of the actual results of these restorations. We did see some shifts in trait means, but both in the shorter term before after study, as well as the longer term study comparing restored and unrestored sites, we didn't really see differences in functional diversity. The other suggestion that comes out of this work is to focus a little bit more on the provisioning of flowering resources for pollinators, since that is a goal that many managers mentioned to us, that we don't see that restoration has really shifted that much. So they may need to, in a targeted way, try and add species that are filling in some of the gaps in the floral phenology. And finally, just to have a couple more minutes left, I'm going to talk for 10 seconds about another project that we're working on in my lab. Lesrocelandine is a spring ephemeral invasive plant that is very abundant in river valleys in our area. I hope that you don't have it in Montana, but I'm not sure. You may have a little bit of it. But one of my students is looking at how communities respond to multi-year management. In our area and some of the metro parks, this is one of the biggest targets of invasive species management. And looking at years of consecutive treatment here on this axis, and the x-axis, and then the y-axis is the fraction of the community that has native species. Early data seem to indicate that treating for longer was leading to a higher native community. But we have gone back to visit some of these sites over time to see whether that really holds up, particularly because this, management is significant disturbance in these areas, and this spring ephemeral species actually disappears. So we're taking an across the year look at what happens longer term as a result of some of these invasive management projects. And so with that, I think I'm just about out of time. So I'll mention that we have received tremendous support from our local park districts, as well as from the Garden Club of America. And we've had a number of field assistants, as well as study design assistants as well. So I'd like to acknowledge that. And I'll be happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Emily. And I would like to encourage the students. We have like, I don't know how many people are in here, but at least 30-ish. Yeah, so who has questions? Please raise hands, and I think our speaker can pick up your voices.
Hopefully.
Michael? So, Emily, can you hear Michael?
I cannot. I can hear that he's talking, but I can't understand what he's saying.
Maybe come closer to this white box here.
Towards the beginning, you were talking about what traits you were going to consider, and I think you
you mentioned that you wanted traits that were I'm not sure I understood this correctly, but you said you wanted the traits present in at least 80% of the species. Is that correct?
So yes, so more or less. So for a trait analysis, you want to have traits for at least 80% of the cover of that area. So if you look at the species that you have, for about 80% of what is there by abundance, you need to have those functional traits for them. So these trait databases have fascinating numbers of, I forget how many different types of traits they have in the TRI database, but it's hundreds of different traits. But those may only be available for one or two of the species that we have. So we had to look for traits that were available that were there for most of the species that we had.
So for example, if you wanted to measure seed mass, you know the seed mass of 80% of the plant cover.
So 80%, exactly. So 80% of the plant cover, you'd have to be able to get the seed mass either from a plant trait database or from the literature. Seed mass you can find in the literature as well sometimes directly, and also potentially just going out and measuring it yourself.
Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. Somebody else? While people are thinking, Emily, I was wondering, so what kind of habitat was it that you wanted to restore? Because you mentioned meadows. Are those long grass prairie habitats or ecosystems? What are they exactly that you're trying to put back instead of the agriculture area, long use of agriculture, I suppose, right?
So that's a good question. So in our area, the real native habitat would be forest. And so these meadows would be replaced by forest. There are prairies in Ohio, but not our part of Ohio. Northeast Ohio is pretty much just like Pennsylvania. So there are hills and things and abundant rain from the Great Lakes. So what most managers are trying to establish is a more open habitat. Probably you could call it a shorter grass prairie. Some of the managers did have taller grasses that they were trying to establish with varying success in some areas, but most of it, the picture here is kind of representative. So I can walk through most of these fields. I'm not particularly tall. So I would say not that much that's more than 5 feet tall.
And is that, so then in this case, when your native habitats were forests, so would you call this kind of maybe like an early successional status of a forest? So you would let it go on the path of succession. So you maybe believe that in like a couple of decades, they turn into woodlands?
They would definitely turn into woodlands if they were not mowed.
Okay.
There's another site that's not included in this study that used to be the site of a major sports complex, and the soil there is so compacted that even some of our invasives have a hard time growing very tall. So if the soil is compacted enough here, you probably wouldn't get a forest. But these sites, I think that most of them are mowed every other year, every third year, something like that, because otherwise you have a lot of shrubs appearing pretty quickly, and then it does go to smaller trees and bigger trees pretty quickly.
Thank you. Any other questions? So Caitlin, back in the room, can you, okay.
Just after monitors like that habitat for wildlife and pollinators, but then we monitor wildlife and pollinators.
So do you, I don't know if you heard it, but Caitlin was asking whether you are monitoring the wildlife and like in pollinators and wildlife, or is that a data that you kind of just suppose with more pollinators, plants there?
Yeah, so that's a great question. As far as I know, that is not being monitored. The land managers do collect observational data, but not in a systematic way. So they have some information about the species that they have observed themselves, but there are no active surveys that are going on in these areas looking at pollinators or wildlife specifically.
Great. In a way, Caitlin is working in a project with a pollinator garden, so she's hoping to do that more systematically. But in a way, in our area, that is also kind of a thing that we lack, because we mainly just would like to see whether the vegetation we established is working or not, is it developing a way. But then other responses like the pollinators, bugs, wildlife is usually neglected. Not that I think that's for most people, probably the most interesting thing, whether there's deer, rabbits, whatever, coming back to the area, or different kinds of butterflies, different kinds of insects, but it's still not really monitored too well. So
I
interesting.
would say probably deer are the best monitored because we have a real deer overabundance problem here. So most parks survey for deer, and many of them actually actively call deer because they eat all the natives. And so that's probably the one thing that there's some information about. Caitlin, in our area, there's also been some very interesting studies about urbanization and pollinator services in cities, maybe a little bit less relevant for your context, but maybe within the city. Mary Gardner's work out of Ohio State had a lot of ideas about surveying for different insect and spider functional groups. So I'd be happy to email you some of those if you're interested in that.
Great. Yeah. Any other questions? Because if not, I have a couple still, but I don't want to overwhelm Emily. Yes, Chris.
So I'm just curious why you want to suppress that before.
So Chris asked, in a way, why would you like to suppress the succession of a woodland? And I'm not sure if that's the case, but you could have started with planting forests, right?
Yes, so Chris, that's a great question. And some areas we are actively seeking to restore forests. But for these meadows in particular, for a variety of reasons, how parks are managed can vary. So in these more open fields, you're much more likely to be able to see a variety of bird species. And so a lot of the people interested in conservation generally, a lot of people get into that through birding. And because Pennsylvania for a long time had less forest, and now it's almost completely forested. And so some of the birds shifted some of their paths and come through here and are looking for open habitats. So there is a general interest in the conservation community in providing some open habitat, especially for birds and also for pollinators as well. So actively, they're seeking to not have this turn into forest. Some of the sites that are not included in this study locally, where the goal is the same, have to do with what's underneath, where you don't really want very deep-rooted species, and you don't want trees growing there and things like that if there's a landfill cap under that. So that's one of the other reasons why, not for these fields in particular, but regionally, why some people are trying to manage for open habitat. The other restoration thing that's happening a lot here in the East is that we have less of a need for so many golf courses. So we have a lot of golf courses where a park district suddenly gets a golf course that has a long history of fertilization and herbicide use to create perfect lawns. And the people who come to these parks to walk around still want to be able to walk around open areas. And so some of those are actively restored to not have trees, but to have more of these meadow areas.